Hi, I'm Femi OK and you're in the stream. Today, a singer, an assassination attempt and the turmoil of modern Jamaica. We're in conversation with the author, Marlon James. So with us on the set, as you can see, Marlon James. His most recent novel, A Brief History of 7 Killings, has just been longlisted for the Booker Prize. It tells the fictionalised stories of several characters that are all linked together in some way through the singer Bob Marley, who never really appears as Bob Marley. He's known as The Singer.
The Singer.
Good to have you here, Marlon.
Thanks for having me. This is great.
How's your life changed now that you're on the long list of the Man Booker Prize? What's different?
I mean, I have a bigger limo now.
Really?
Yeah.
Nice. Yes.
Yeah, you know, I now have to thank the little people.
Next,
I'm not kidding.
Next to you, we've got our digital producer, Malika Bilal. So if you've got questions for Marlon, send them to Malika. Malika will ask Marlon.
Definitely.
And?
Well, we've actually tapped into a whole new community with this, and they are very excited. They have lots of questions. But along from those from our community, we also have a panel of young writers with us. Akila White, a blogger. Naomi Jackson is an author. Her debut novel, The Star Side of Bird Hill, was published in June. And Stephen Narain is a novelist and essayist. We're excited to have them all here.
Now, we'll have more conversation with Marlon, Akila, Naomi, and Stephen, and you, of course, in just a moment. First, here's a look at a few of the hashtags we're keeping an eye on. If you've never come across Marlon James's work, this is an introduction, a little clip, a little snippet from the book. A character called Bam Bam has a chapter, in fact several chapters, and he is in a gang in Jamaica. And here's a little bit of Marlon James reading from early on in the novel. Marlon?
The man who bring guns to the ghetto, bring more guns and say, he's not going to be happy until every man, woman, and picnic in Rima bleed. But both parties stun when a third P rise up, you. And you come on the TV in the Chinese shop saying that your life is not for you, and if you can't help plenty people, then you don't want it. And you do something else in the ghetto even though you're not there. I'm not sure how you do it. Maybe it was the base, something you can't see but feel, and who feels it know it. But a woman will talk to herself, let her tongue loose in her backyard, cursing with each ring of the shirt and pants she washing, saying she's tired of the system and the ism and schism, and it's high time the big tree meet the small axe. But she didn't say it, she sing it, so we know it's you. And plenty in the ghetto, in Copenhagen City, in Rima, and for sure in the 8 lanes, sing it too. The two men who bring guns to the ghetto don't know what to do, since when music hit you, you can't hit it back.
Really brings to life, those words kind of leap off the page, and they're bringing to life this atmosphere of what it was like to live there at that time. And this is speaking from a non-Jamaican. We also had Jamaicans online who agreed, so that's saying something. This is Mark, and he says, the book is rich and layered, and he tells a story about his mom grew up in this area and knew a notorious gang leader at the time, and he goes on to say, seeing these conversations around that time was fascinating, and it brings it to life, but it's sad that the period had to happen at all. So he talks about growing up with some of these stories. Is that the same for you? Did you grow up with these stories?
Yes and no. I grew up with these stories almost indirectly, because I grew up very Jamaican middle class, which is kind of one of our deep, dark secrets that we actually have a middle class in Jamaica. But you know, my mom was a policewoman. She was a detective. My father was a lawyer, so we're never far away from it. And also in Jamaica, I think, especially in the 70s, you're never far away from anything. You're never far away from violence or the rumor of violence. You're not far away from this sort of huge political culture. There's a character in the book, I think it's Nina, who says she hates politics and she hates that she's supposed to know. And that's the thing, you know, no matter how removed you are from it, you are always in the middle of it. So everybody has an intimate memory of the 70s. Everybody has an intimate memory of violence or political consciousness as well.
Can you give us an example, Marlon? When did you realize as a youngster, it was like, oh, where I live, it's like Starsky and Hutch every day?
Well, that's just my viewing habits and my T-shirt. But it's I don't know, because when you're in it, you just think it's pretty normal.
So as a kid, what would be normal for you then?
Well, for me, my upbringing was pretty stable and normal. So it would be eating, Wonder bread and all these things that seem to be dumped from America and just trying to be a kid. I think the difference is, and my parents were very good, I think, at sheltering us from some of the realities, but not that great. I think there are things that you would catch. Like I could tell when my parents were scared.
Okay.
I could tell when something went too far.
How could you tell that they were
You could
scared?
just tell by the whispering, by them not saying it in front of you, by seeing the uncertainty on faces. Even with the people who are in a background or removed by, say, class, where they're not affected by any of that. You can tell, like, the Marley shooting was a turning point, and I was only 6, but I knew something changed. Because in hindsight, I know it's because somebody who was untouchable got touched. But the sense that all bets are off, the sense that it could happen to anybody. And kids can tell when their parents are scared.
I've got a picture of you on my laptop. We're going to show you. You sent it to us, so I know you weren't that embarrassed about it.
I'm probably still embarrassed.
How old are you here?
Which picture is that again?
That's there we go.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
How old was I? I would have been what, 15, 16 maybe?
You look like you're in a terrible mood.
I was in a terrible mood because I didn't want to be
like?
photographed. I was just such a grouch. I was grouchy, I was cynical. I was there drawing comics, and that's Batman, The Dark Knight Returns beside me. So I was pretty much
Were you like
using it as a
nerdy?
Bible.
Were you nerdy?
I was nerdy, but I had a really filthy mouth.
Ooh.
So, which I'm not going to display here.
Thank you. We
But
appreciate that.
I was certainly a huge comic nerd.
Yeah.
I was a huge comic geek. I was very much into sci-fi, very much into comics, X-Men, Batman,
Right.
And so on.
So this is the 70s. You born 1970s. So this is sort of the late 70s, early 80s. So that's
This would be like the mid
time frame.
80s.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The late 70s, I wouldn't have even been in high school yet.
Right.
And yeah, it's for a kid, it's still a world of wonder. It's in hindsight you realize sometimes what was going on.
Yeah.
And how being in Jamaica, being so near Kingston, you weren't that far removed from it. I think it's a very weird and very strange type of political culture where it just affects all your life. But yeah, I was also a super nerd. I read everything. I read Little House in the Big Woods by Laura Ingalls Wilder.
Well, that was a great book then.
Yeah.
Explains why.
I did too. How weird.
It's so weird. I was on a panel. There was a writer from Iran and a writer from, I think, Indonesia. And when I said Little House in the Big Woods, she was like, oh my God, that was the book as well. So it's like everybody in the world having this sort of literary eureka moment by reading Laura Ingalls Wilder.
Well, speaking of a literary eureka moment, I want to bring in one of our guests who met you at a literary festival and also grew up in Jamaica and Kingston during a different generation. But Akila, did any of this resonate with you?
Certainly it did. I'm actually originally from Montego Bay. So I was born long after, in the 80s, but you still grew up hearing stories around that time, especially certain lines that political leaders made. About what Michael Manley said about if you don't want to stay, you can get on things to Florida. They're still leaving every day. Siaga's blood speech. So a lot of it was still current at the time, even though I didn't have a context for it. So it was really strange actually reading the book and seeing the rumors and stories that you heard in print. It was almost like what's true or what's not, because it's still fiction, but somehow it takes on a greater resilience.
Yeah, Kira, I like that, because I was thinking that too, because there were vague memories for me as a youngster of Bob Marley and these concerts and Manley, and like these things were from my childhood.
Right.
Did you deliberately go, okay, this is going to be fiction, this is going to be the fact, I'm going to mess it all up, mash it all up.
Yeah.
How did you do that?
I did set out to sort of mess it all up.
Yeah.
You know, certainly a game of being elusive to a point. But I think also that I was also playing with things that are rumor, that there aren't any sort of written established facts about. You know, one of the things that I'm sure Akila can even talk about is that a lot of this stuff is just stuff we just don't talk about. You know, we whisper and infer it, and everybody knows it, but nobody says it.
Yeah.
But so there was always there was that sense, and it's funny because I wasn't exactly trying to muckrack with the book, and a lot of times I do descend into fiction, but it's once the novel started to almost write itself, a lot of that came out. A lot of this is just me trying to make sense of the 70s. And to make sense of the 70s, it ends up going all the way to 1991.
Wow.
And I'm still trying to make sense of it.
That's some unpacking right there. You originally were going to start the book somewhere other than at the beginning. So this is the beginning of the book. Show us visually where you
visually where I can
start of the book.
The actual, you mean the first thing, the very first thing I wrote is right here on page 458.
All right, so Steadicam Dave is coming up to you. So you see that there. That was where you started. And then the beginning of the book is actually 400 and some pages earlier.
400 and some pages earlier, yeah.
Interesting. What happened?
What happened is I had no idea what I was doing. I honestly, this is in some ways not the most unstructured and the craziest book I ever wrote. It started out being the shortest book I was trying to write. It started out being a novella.
Right.
So I was.
So Marlon, now that Marlon, I've been a fan since John Crow's Devil, and I would love to hear about how this process differed from the other two novels that you wrote.
So John Crow's Devil was your first.
Was my first novel, and Book of Nightmare was my second. And both of those two books were very structured books. John Crow's Devil is pretty short, but I also was trying to write something that's almost like an allegory.
Yeah.
So it's sort of a once upon a time kind of story, except it gets really violent. And Night Woman also was very much, it was in first person. It's about, you know, a bunch of slave women who plan their own rebellion. But it was still very much tied into a sort of Victorian idea of what a novel is. It goes on an arc, there's a climax and so on. This was the first where I really didn't know what I was doing. And I started out writing short pieces. This page 458 was the beginning of a novella that was set in Miami about characters living in Chicago. And the Jamaican thing was incidental.
Yeah.
And I just couldn't get anywhere with it. And then I started another novella with a character Bam Bam, who I just read. And I kept writing these failed novellas.
I like the way that you wrote the failed bits and then you saved them.
Oh yeah, you have to save it.
You save your failures.
You gotta save the bad work.
Right,
I have some hilariously bad novels that hopefully will never get published.
Until you're long gone, and then somebody will dig them up and then make money out of them.
And destroy
That's
my
a pretty amazing rescue mission. Do you think that that's why there's so many characters in this book? There's like 75 characters.
I think that's one of the reasons. I also think that, and I would love to take credit for it, but it wasn't my idea that it was a novel. It was my friend Rachel who said, you know, this is a novel, right? I was like, no, it's not a novel. I just need to find the best person. I said, I have no idea whose story this is.
Yeah.
And she said, why do you think it's one person's story? When last have you read As I Lay Dying? And that was a big moment for me, going back and reading that novel it's basically one central event and so many characters speaking about it in first person. And that's where it really started to come together. But pretty much all the novels I write are sort of a wrestling match with myself. I mean, like, you can't do this.
And then you do it.
And then I do it.
Right.
I got to the point where I just said, you know what? I'll just leave it until my editor says chop it out.
Well, I like that you talked about whose story is this and not having to be one person's story.
Yeah.
Because if anything, the person's story that it is not is the singer. It is not Bob Marley's story. So there's a video comment from our community on that note. Have a listen to Dominique.
Hello, Marlon. My name's Dominic. I'm a fellow Jamaican and extremely proud of your work and your success. My question to you was, Bob Marley in the novel seems to be seen by the people from Copenhagen City as being inauthentic. He's behind on the music that's actually popular in the ghetto, and he's essentially adopting uptown music, or the music that has finally reached uptown. Was that how he was really seen? Is that what your research has revealed?
That's a good question. I think it's not that he was forgotten or upstaged or anything. It's not like that. But by that time, there was already a counter movement. There was already a type of reggae that came up from the street, dancehall, which was also already in response to roots reggae, sort of like hip hop and funk. And like hip hop, dancehall was almost the music of people who couldn't afford instruments. Your instrument was flip the single and the B-side, and then you toast on top of the instrumental. So if you were young at that point, Marley and people like that were already they're already superstars, they're already icons. They weren't forgotten, but a new sort of street level music had already started to rise. You're talking Dillinger and Mighty Diamonds and Big Youth with Big Youth and this sort of, and U-Roy. So there was already this sort of street sort of thing coming up, which didn't overshadow him at all. But it was an announcement of the 70s generation. Now we're making music, and we're not necessarily deriving, not necessarily drawing from the same things the people who came out of ska and rocksteady. Because Marley came out of ska. He came out of ska. He came out of rocksteady, just like a lot of the guys from that era. So it really was. It wasn't necessarily that they disrespected it, but they already looked at it as somebody else's music.
Right. A different generation
Yeah.
of music.
Marlon, one of the things that really fascinates me about the book is the musicality of the writing. And so, there's sentences that seem to go on forever and spiral and spiral. So my thing is, were you listening to music while you were writing? Like, were you actually listening to Marley and to other reggae artists?
I always listen to music when I write. I cannot write in silence. I will leave my empty house and go to a cafe and write.
Really? You need that noise?
I need the noise. I need the noise. I need the musicality. I was listening to a lot. Funny enough, I was listening to a lot of Augustus Pablo, a lot of dub music, which is probably why the first chapter is called Original Rockers, which is an Augustus Pablo album. So I was listening to that. Lots of Bob Marley, but also lots of Dennis Brown, lots of Dillinger, a lot of 70s reggae.
Yeah. Let me just play a little bit from 1976. This is the Smile concert that happened in Jamaica. That's part of the actual conversation in the book. Have a listen to this. So you talked about taboos, some of the things that people in Jamaica don't necessarily talk about. One is perhaps maybe dishing on Bob Marley a little bit, saying that he might not have been the icon that the rest of the world kind of thought that he might be. The other thing is Rastas. Rastas get a hard time in your book. Lice-infested Rastas, I quote, many, many times. What was happening in the 70s with Rastafarianism that the Jamaicans didn't like Rastas? I
think people forget how much of a struggle Rastafarianism had in the 70s. They suffered for it. They suffered for it. They really paid for being Rastafarians in blood. It's funny because I live, when I'm in Jamaica, I live on Lady Musgrave Road, which is can be a very, very posh neighborhood. And there are times I get home and I'm at my gate and I go, if this were just 10 years ago, the police would have swooped down, I'd have been beaten, almost left to death, and just because I am clearly some dirty Rasta going into some decent house. So and a lot of that resentment was there. A lot of that resentment came from the up-and-coming Jamaican middle class, who at times despised Rastafarianism. There is some resentment because Rastafarianism, people forget, is not a racial movement. A lot of people don't take, for example,
Marlon,
white.
I guess I wonder, you're sitting here talking about this wearing locks, and I wonder if you had if your family gave you a hard time about that.
No, by the time,
a police officer. I wonder.
It's funny, isn't it weird?
I like that, Naomi. Everybody was thinking that, and Naomi said it out loud.
Because the son of the cops. I think by the time I started wearing it, they really, you know, they really mellowed and changed. And I think it also speaks to Jamaica in itself, that attitude changed pretty, well, I mean, it took a good 20 years.
Point? Because,
well, Bob Marley was a huge turning point, for one. That Rastafarianism was responsible for so much of our pop culture. I grew up, there was already literature in Patois, in Jamaican dialect. But reggae musicians were the first to take it seriously.
Yeah.
So the type of speaking about really serious, really complicated, really sad things, reggae artists did it first.
Okay, but sorry, from another aspect though, the one thing I appreciated about the novel too was that in your various critiques of the various societies in Jamaica, even Rastafari wasn't left out of it. Not from that biased perspective, but I remember seeing, I think, where they're visiting, I think it's 12 tribes, or there's some Rasta community, and you point out how for a group that is for, you know, equality and fight for your rights, their attitude towards women is not very progressive.
No.
And I found that
Akila, leave that thought there, because we're running out of time in the main show. We'll pick up in the post show. But this is a good point. This is not a good woman's book. Women don't fare well in this book.
Right. Yeah, and not just Nina, but in general. I think we're forgetting just how far we've been and how far we have left to go. And Nina is a good example of that. Yeah. Because she is someone who's very well aware of the cards that are stacked against her, and she's very, very clear about that at all times. She's the one who notices the contradictions in a movement that sometimes pushes equality, but it's still, you know, certain at a time,
the women are serving
very
the
sexist.
men.
They're serving the men.
Yeah.
It's still very sort of very sexist, and I think, and I really wanted to capture those contradictions. And also, I certainly didn't want to sugarcoat anything in the book.
No sugarcoating going on.
Women don't fare well. Yeah. Femi and I were talking before the show, but not a whole lot of people fare well. So this is Irie on Twitter, and she wants to know how it was living with this violent story happening in your head all the time. Because this is a horror movie in a book.
Yeah.
You know, Lord knows it's not the first violent story I've written. In some ways, I think my second novel is a lot more violent. I think I have to get to the point, you know, I'm sure Naomi and Stephen can chime in on that. I think you have to get to the point where the writing is what it is, and the writing demands it. The writing doesn't care how you feel. So the stuff I can write when I'm really depressed is not really different from the stuff I write when I'm really happy.
Really?
No, honestly.
What's the point of being really happy then? Or what's the point of being really depressed?
Well, especially if you believe in this thing, the muse, and I believe in it, she really doesn't care.
Really?
The writing demands it. So when people say, like, what's your process with writing a book? I say, it really depends on the book.
Yeah.
And for me at least, I had to get to a point where, regardless of what's going on, honestly, the book doesn't care.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons why the book doesn't care is that hopefully by that time you have characters who are people.
Yeah.
And that was certainly with my last novel, that was a struggle, letting go of the book. And this was to come back actually to Naomi's question. One of the big differences I think between this book and the others, that this was the one where I let the characters go from the beginning. So I really had no idea where it was going. I had no idea it was going to go to the 90s. I thought I was going to write this novel. It starts with this assassination attempt, and it's going to just circle around it for the next 20 to 100 pages and keep going back and forth. I had no idea it was going to go forward because the characters move forward, and you kind of have to let them go.
It's a really hard book to describe. It felt to me like Charles Dickens on ganja.
No controlled substances were consumed while doing this book.
These amazing stories with all of these characters, and somehow they all weave together. How would you describe it in the last 30 seconds of this show?
Wow, if I could describe it, I wouldn't have written it. I don't know. I was trying to, you know, I think if you're going to make sense of the 70s, you have to go on a big canvas.
Yes.
And I think it's still a pretty small story.
Yeah.
But in Jamaica, there's no small stories. There's no one narration. There's no one version. You're
listening to Marlon James. He's the author of A Brief History of 7 Killings. This show is not big enough for Marlon James. We are taking him to the post show. Stream.aljazeera.com. See you there. So it's good to have you back. We are back with Marlon James, author of A Brief History of 7 Killings. Plus we have Akila, Naomi and Stephen. Akila, Naomi and Stephen, we are going to Periscope for 5 minutes. So hold tight on your questions. I know I have got 50 that I want to ask. I know you've got a ton, but hold tight for a moment because we're actually Periscoping on a little phone going back and forth. So the people on Periscope won't be able to hear you, but we'll bring you in just a moment. So Malika, over to you.
Several people have already joined, and that's why I'm holding up this phone. Don't be alarmed. But one of the things a lot of people in our community wanted to talk about was the use of language that you employed in the book. So I'm pulling up a tweet here. This is from Valerie, and she says, how do patois, Creole, vernacular, and the language and the culture, quote unquote, matter to you at a time when we must repeat that Black Lives Matter? So she links in a whole bunch of things there, but the use of language and the characters employing their native tongue, really, it kind of wove a ribbon throughout the book that had them sticking up for themselves in ways that you might be able to explain better than I am.
A lot of it was very personal. It took me a while to accept that the voice that comes out of my mouth can be the voice that I can use to tell a story. And the previous novel was a literal fight between me and a character over whose voice it should be. There's still a first draft of that novel that's in Queen's English. It's terrible.
You're kidding.
It's really it's very proper though. So the idea, especially when I went into first person, the idea that these characters have to tell their stories in their language, not mine. And what is funny, because even with that, there's still issues. Like one of the running things in the book is people criticizing other people's language. A character who is not necessarily speaking Queen's English talking about how that person chat bad. Yeah. So there's still, even with this reclamation and this pride, there's still shame.
Right. And there's also parts of the book where people are grappling with themselves in their minds about chatting bad. Oh, I didn't want to chat bad, but I did, or I did to show this guy.
Yeah, and there's still that, and some of that is just growing up and hearing, because my mother was very proper. So if she got Jamaican, you knew you were in trouble.
Uh-oh.
And I've done that. I'd be even at a meeting in America, I go, you guys don't want me to get Jamaican in this.
Oh.
Yeah.
So there is that, and there is, because you recognize the power of it. There is it goes without saying there's an authenticity to it, but it's also.
Could you get a little Jamaican for us on Periscope?
Just
a
like
little
that?
Jamaican, yeah.
One of them would have probably talked to me a little bit still, but here's the funny thing. Even when I was growing up, people thought I did not speak Jamaican.
Yeah. But did they think you were posh?
Yeah, they thought I was posh.
Okay.
It's so weird. Somebody reminded me.
You are quite posh.
No, I'm not posh.
A little bit posh.
All right, maybe a little bit.
A couple of people are speaking in patois here. Jah will provide. What does that mean?
Oh, God will provide.
Okay.
That's an easy one. I could do that one.
Yeah.
Oh, do people kiss their lips in your book? I didn't see that. I didn't hear that.
Well, yeah, but nobody knows what kiss teeth means. I think I just said hiss.
Yeah, because you can't. I don't even know how you would spell it.
Yeah.
Technically, though, just on the language thing, is that there's a technical issue with how do you show vernacular?
Right.
How do you write vernacular? And how do you do it without, there were no footnotes in here, there's no glossary in here. So do you you're on your own, peeps, just do it?
I was on,
how did you help?
yeah, there was an element of that.
Yeah.
Again, that wasn't my idea. My first novel, it was the editor who says, if you put a glossary, you're exoticizing your own tongue.
Oh.
You're reinforcing the whole idea that it's different, it's other, and you need to interpret. And I was like, no, let them.
Thought of it like that.
Because the thing about dialect, the thing about patois is, after a while you do get the rhythm.
Definitely.
Once you get the rhythm, then you understand it. And I think that's really what it's about.
Although I will say I had to look up, I Urban Dictionary a couple times just to make sure that I knew exactly what was going on.
Yeah.
Malika, one more for Periscope, and then we're going to
yes,
go back to
this one is
the peeps.
This one is an interesting one. I'm pulling up here. It's also on language. This is just someone's speaking their mind. It goes, says, language in your second novel as well was something that she picked up on. I speak Nigerian Pidgin English, and I was struck by how similar the 18th century patois was to it.
I'm sort of surprised or not surprised. I was in Nigeria, and people would start walking up to me and just start speaking Pidgin. And I understood it for the most part. But yeah, it's surprising how similar it is. It's surprising how much of the African we've retained, which a lot of Jamaicans don't know. We'll hear a phrase, like kude, or gwe, or nyam, and I realize that these things, these are twee words and so on. So there is that, and then there is when our African languages came in collision with English, the results were pretty similar all over the diaspora. So I think that's why. And but it was very. I was struck by it too because we don't know and nobody tells us these things.
Right.
I wasn't aware that I spoke so much African until somebody from Ghana came to Jamaica, and it just blew his mind.
Can you do a goodbye in patois for us? Because we're just going to leave Periscope and then go back to our post show. Yeah.
Actually, what would be a good?
How would you say?
It is. I'm trying to remember if you said
goodbye,
like,
probably.
No, man. You said like until next time and like see you.
Nice.
Yeah.
Beautiful. All right, Periscope. See ya. Moving back to the post show. Hello, Akila, Naomi, and Stephen. I know it was really hard for you to sit and not join in. I'm going to release the beast now. Stephen, quick question. What do you want to ask Marlon?
Yeah. Marlon, I know in a lot of reviews, and I think you use this word yourself, you describe the book, the writing, sort of the context of this as post-colonial. And I was wondering if you could parse that out a little bit for us.
Yeah, post-colonial, mostly because I'm just annoyed with the term post-colonial. I think it was important. I think it is still important, but I think it's too wide a net, and it's starting to include stories that just do not fall under that context. All we can say is person of color, former British colony, and people think it's a post-colonial story.
That's right.
And if you grew up in the 70s, you're watching Sesame Street, you're seeing American television. If there's any sort of cultural dominance, it's North America. And I think also we've gotten to the point where our stories don't need the hovering of the so-called mother country. We're not telling those stories anymore. I think they're important stories, but I think that we have stories that exist in the context of just themselves. That you can tell a family story that exists purely in the context of that family. You can tell a political story that's purely in the context of that country.
Would you invent a new literary genre, or do you feel like you don't need a literary genre?
I don't know if we invent it. I think it was, in some ways, it was always there. But I do think that it hasn't outlived its usefulness. There's still novels that are written in response to it, and there should be, because there's still things we haven't spoken about yet, like slavery, which we think we have, but we haven't. But I think there's so many novels and so many writers and there's so many books that exist in a context where they're just trying to make sense of the present.
So do you think it's just lazy having genres there? It's like, oh, it puts a label on someone, and that makes it.
I think it is lazy. Yeah. Naomi, you're going to say something?
Yeah, Marlon, I'm really excited about this book. It took over 2 months of my life last fall, so I'll never get back.
It took you 2 months to read this book?
Yeah, it did.
What are you doing, reading a page a day? What's going on?
I was taking notes. But I'm really excited that it's going to get turned into HBO miniseries. And so I wanted to know, what do you think are the challenges of writing for screen versus writing novels, as you have been for so long? What do you see ahead?
What I find so far, because I've been writing a script, is that you have to depend so much more on the actuality of the scene. You don't get your metaphors, you don't get your inward development, and this is the bulk of this novel are characters just thinking. So now, how do you translate that to a screen? You realize you can't have a monologue going on for 30 minutes. So sometimes you have to invent characters for them to talk to. So there are characters who have had to create that don't exist in the book.
So you're involved in the HBO series as well. You're helping to write it?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, interesting.
So, and I think one of the things, I mean, I'm as much influenced by film as I am by books, and sometimes even more so. Because now there's so much more weight put on dialogue. If you're not a dialogue person, you simply cannot write a script.
This is true.
Because it has to, on one hand, have resonance, but it also has to seem like you're not talking to the viewer. So,
so Marlon, I have a follow-up question. You were talking about comic books, and I didn't know that you love comic books, but it now makes a little bit more sense to me.
Yeah?
Do you think that there's some influence of comic books on your writing?
I think so. I think certainly in how to tell multiple stories, certainly in when I write something that sort of goes into fantastical, there's so much I think. Also, funny enough, comics taught me how to put intellectual weight in a story that's almost total action. Certainly a comic like X-Men and so on, and also just the whole idea that you can still build this kind of world of wonder, that you can, there can be some zap and pow to a literary novel, and I think, you know, it's also a reminder that I should have fun when
I'm writing. So in connection to that, though, in connection to sort of Stephen's and Yomi's question, because when Stephen pointed out about that post-colonial thing, and I thought this book and the last one, The Book of Night Woman, and even the John Crow's Devil, seemed really different to me than the Jamaican novels that tend to get classed as post-colonial. Like it just...
Akita, make this a short question because we're running out of time. Go.
Sorry,
what's the question in a sentence is what?
Yeah, so I was saying it felt as if you were kind of writing us into being like people from my time, and it almost felt like you were doing a myth cycle. It's strange, like in terms of your books kind of envisioning our culture in a way that I hadn't seen done before. And I was wondering if that was intentional, like is that a conscious project, or it's just you just write and that's just
I think yes and no. I think when you're writing books, that's the whole thing. You are writing stuff into being. Naomi's novel just did that as well. I think we write out of, stories sometimes arise out of our need for them, I think. And Toni Morrison's one says she wrote the books because she didn't see them to read. She didn't see those books available to be read. And I think that's what novelists, I think that's what we all do, I hope. Certainly these two guys who are being quiet, like as if it's not true.
I literally have 3 minutes left. I'm going to give that 3 minutes to Malika and Marlon. Go ahead,
well, this is from the community, and we're also hearing from writers here. So I'm going to give you some rapid fire questions, two of them. You can answer after I finish both. This is from Nabila. She says, how does an author in the making keep their faith in the West when agents keep rejecting your book because it's foreign? So before you answer that, I want you to listen to this one because it's also about your process and how you keep going. This is Rian.
Hi, Marlon. You've said in past interviews that writing one book often frees you up to write the next. For instance, your previous book freed you up to write something voice-based and spontaneous in A Brief History of 7 Killings. What freedom did A Brief History of 7 Killings bestow upon you for the next book?
I think Brief History of 7 Killings freed me up to just sort of sit still in a story. Because I'm a plot guy, which is funny because I'm, being a literary author, I'm not supposed to care about plot, but I love plot. I will draw charts on the board. Yes, I have a blackboard.
So that is the secret to how you put so many characters and kept track of them.
List character. In fact, at one point I went by hour of the day. So I know at 10:30, Nina is doing this, Josie's doing this, the singer is doing this. One, because that's the only way I was going to keep track. But to come back to his question, which I have totally forgotten.
His question is about freeing you up, and you said you're free now to...
It freed me up certainly to sort of sit still in a scene and sort of let that play out. This also freed me to realize that you don't always have to know where the book is going. And that can be very hard for any creative person because you feel as if you're lost control. And now I actually look for that.
Yeah. You're writing what right now?
I am writing, what am I doing? I'm trying to write a novel that plays on African myths and mythologies and legends. So I'm actually going, speaking of comics, I'm going total geek.
Okay.
So I'm writing
great.
a fantasy novel.
Is a chart required? Have you got post-its and stuff going
I have
on?
a whole room full of post-its, pictures, film, video.
Oh my goodness.
Because I did it, I mean, usually I do it to an extent with each novel where I kind of create a space that's in the feel of it.
Does this mythological story have a title yet?
No, it does not.
Oh, okay.
But
all right.
I'm working on it.
All right. Marlon James, it's been such a pleasure having you here. We have like 3 more hours of stuff to talk to you about, but I have 30 seconds. So I'm just going to say Marlon James, Akila, Naomi, Stephen, and all of our online community, thank you for being part of the show. Really appreciate it. Take care.